I was halfway through clearing the Johnsons' driveway when I saw her marching toward me like a linebacker charging through enemy territory, her purple parka billowing behind her in the freezing January wind. Debra Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association, had the kind of face that looked perpetually displeased, as if she'd been sucking on lemons since birth. I'd heard stories about her from other neighbors, but this was my first direct encounter since I'd started my snow clearing business 3 months ago in suburban Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I shut off the snowblower and pulled down my scarf, expecting maybe she wanted to hire me for her own driveway. That hope lasted about 2 seconds. "Excuse me, but you cannot operate a commercial business in this residential neighborhood," she barked, stopping about 3 feet from me with her hands planted firmly on her hips. Her breath came out in angry puffs of white vapor. I blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "You heard me. This is a residential zone. Commercial vehicles and businesses are strictly prohibited according to our HOA bylaws, Section 7, Subsection 3. I glanced back at my truck, a perfectly normal Ford F-150 with a small magnetic sign on the door that read Ivan Irving Snow Removal Services, along with my phone number. Nothing fancy, nothing industrial, just me, a college student trying to make some money during winter break. "Madam, I'm just clearing snow from driveways. I've got a commercial license, all my permits are in order, and the Johnsons hired me to do this." "I don't care if the president himself hired you," Debra snapped. "The HOA rules clearly state no commercial activities within the neighborhood boundaries. You need to leave immediately, or I'm calling the police." I felt my jaw tighten. I'd worked hard to get my business license, jumped through all the hoops at the city clerk's office, paid the fees, got my liability insurance. Everything was legitimate. "Mrs. Patterson, is it? I'm not running a storefront here. I'm providing a service that homeowners are contracting me for." "That's completely legal." "Not in my neighborhood it isn't." She pulled out her phone with a theatrical flourish. "Last warning, leave now or I'm dialing." The front door of the Johnson house opened, and Margaret Johnson, a sweet elderly woman in her 70s, shuffled out onto her porch in her slippers and bathrobe. "Debra, what on earth is going on? Ivan is doing exactly what I hired him to do." "Margaret, you're in violation of HOA regulations. You'll be receiving a fine notice in the mail." "A fine? For having my driveway cleared? That's ridiculous. The rules are the rules." Debra's finger hovered over her phone screen. "Well, young man, are you leaving?" I looked at Mrs. Johnson, who looked distressed and cold on her porch, then back at Debra. Something in me refused to back down. I'd done everything by the book. I wasn't going to be bullied by some power-hungry HOA president who probably had nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood looking for violations. "No, madam. I'm finishing the job I was hired to do." Debra's eyes widened like I just slapped her. Without another word, she jabbed at her phone and held it to her ear. "Yes, police. I need to report illegal commercial activity in my neighborhood. There's a man here operating a business without proper authorization." I pulled out my own phone and texted Mrs. Johnson to go back inside where it was warm, that I'd handle this. She hesitated, but eventually shuffled back indoors. Then I waited, continuing to clear the driveway because I sure as hell wasn't going to leave it half-finished. Debra stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching me like a hawk while we waited for the cops. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees, and the wind chill made it feel even colder. My nose had gone numb, but I kept working. The rhythmic roar of the snowblower was almost meditative, and I focused on creating clean, even paths through the 6 inches of fresh powder we'd gotten overnight. About 20 minutes later, a Milwaukee Police Department cruiser rolled up to the curb. A uniformed officer stepped out, a middle-aged guy with a thick mustache and the resigned expression of someone who'd responded to way too many nonsense calls. His nameplate read, Officer Kowalski. Debra immediately rushed over to him, talking fast and gesturing wildly at me and my truck. I shut off the snowblower again and walked over, my commercial license already pulled up on my phone. "Officer, thank you so much for coming," Debra was saying. "This man is operating an illegal commercial business in our residential neighborhood. We have strict HOA bylaws against this, and he's refused to leave despite multiple warnings." Officer Kowalski looked at her, then at me, then at my truck, then back at her. "Madam, what exactly is the nature of the commercial activity?" "He's running a snow removal business. Right here. In a residential zone." The officer turned to me. "Son, you got a license for this business?" "Yes, sir." I handed him my phone, which showed my digital commercial license from the Wisconsin Department of Revenue. "Ivan Irving. I started the business in October. Got my liability insurance too, if you need to see that." He studied the screen for a moment, scrolling through the details, then handed my phone back. "This looks legitimate to me. City of Milwaukee, proper tax registration, everything's in order. But the HOA bylaws," Debra started. "Madam, with all due respect, HOA bylaws don't supersede state and municipal law. This young man has a valid commercial license issued by the state of Wisconsin. He's operating a mobile service business, which is perfectly legal in residential areas. He's not running a storefront, not causing a disturbance, not violating any noise ordinances at this hour. I don't see a problem here." Debra's face was turning an impressive shade of red. "So you're telling me he can just operate a business in my neighborhood?" "It's not your neighborhood, madam. It's a collection of private properties. If a homeowner wants to hire someone to clear their driveway, that's their right. The HOA can't prohibit residents from hiring legitimate businesses for home services. If they could, you couldn't have plumbers, electricians, landscapers, or anyone else providing services. That's different." "No, madam, it really isn't." Officer Kowalski's tone was patient but firm. "Unless he's parking commercial vehicles overnight on the street, operating during restricted hours, or running an actual business location from a residence, there's no violation of any ordinance I'm aware of." I tried not to smile, but I felt a surge of vindication. I'd known I was in the right, but hearing it from a cop made it official. "This is outrageous," Debra sputtered. "I'm going to file a formal complaint with the city." "That's certainly your right, madam, but I'm telling you right now, you're not going to get anywhere with it." Officer Kowalski turned back to me. "You're good to continue working, son. Just make sure you're following all the standard safety protocols and not blocking traffic." "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." The officer nodded, walked back to his cruiser, and drove off. I watched him go, then looked back at Debra, who was standing there looking like she'd just bitten into a rotten egg. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm just trying to make some money for college. I'm not trying to cause problems for anyone." She pointed a shaking finger at me. "This isn't over. The HOA board will be discussing this at our next meeting. You can count on that." Then she spun on her heel and stalked off down the sidewalk toward what I assumed was her house. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, before firing up the snowblower again and finishing Mrs. Johnson's driveway. When I was done, I knocked on her door. She answered immediately, looking worried. "Ivan, I'm so sorry about all that. Debra is, well, she's very particular about the rules." "It's not your fault, Mrs. Johnson. Officer said I'm perfectly legal to operate here." She handed me a check for $45, which was my standard rate for a driveway her size, plus a $5 tip. "You did a wonderful job, dear. Don't let Debra bully you. She tries to intimidate everyone." "I won't. Thanks for the work." I had 4 more jobs lined up that day, all within the Meadowbrook Hills neighborhood. Word had spread fast about my affordable rates and reliable service. Most of the big commercial snow removal companies charged twice what I did, and I was young and energetic enough to do a thorough job. Plus, I actually cared about doing it right. My next job was 3 streets over at the Hendersons' place. Rick Henderson was a friendly guy in his 40s who worked from home as a software engineer. He came out to chat while I worked, sipping coffee from a giant mug. "Heard you had a run-in with Debra this morning," he said with a grin. "News traveled fast in suburbia." "Yeah, she called the cops on me. Officer said my license was valid though, so I'm good." "That sounds like Debra. She's been on a power trip ever since she got elected HOA president 2 years ago. Last summer she tried to fine me because my grass was a 1/4 inch too tall according to her measurements. A 1/4 inch. I had to get my own measuring tape and prove her wrong." I shook my head, focusing on the heavy wet snow near his garage. What's her deal? Why is she so obsessed with the rules? Honestly, I think she's just bored and miserable. Her kids moved away, her husband works all the time, and she's got nothing better to do than patrol the neighborhood with a clipboard and a bad attitude. She's given violations to probably half the houses here for one thing or another. Sounds exhausting. You have no idea. There's been talk about voting her out, but she's got a couple of cronies on the board who support her. Brenda Walsh and Carol Turner, they're like her personal enforcers. I filed that information away and continued working. The Henderson job took about an hour because they had a long driveway and a sidewalk that wrapped around their property. Rick was pleased with the results and paid me in cash, which was always nice. My 3rd job was at the Kowalski house, no relation to the officer who just cleared me. The 4th was at a young couple's place, the Martinez family, who had a newborn and were grateful not to have to bundle up and shovel themselves. The 5th was at another elderly resident's home, Thomas Patterson. Wait, Patterson. Any relation to Debra Patterson? I asked casually as he handed me his house keys so I could let myself in to use the bathroom if needed. His expression soured immediately. "Unfortunately, yes. She's my sister-in-law, married to my brother David. And before you ask, yes, I know she's difficult. I apologize in advance for whatever she's done or will do." I laughed. "She called the cops on me this morning for clearing Mrs. Johnson's driveway." Thomas groaned. "Of course she did. Look, kid, I'll give you some advice. Keep your paperwork absolutely immaculate. If there's even a tiny thing wrong, she'll try to use it against you. She's vindictive when she thinks someone has challenged her authority." "Thanks for the heads up. Officer Kowalski already confirmed I'm operating legally, so I should be fine. From your lips to God's ears. But seriously, watch yourself. Debra doesn't let things go." That evening, after I'd finished all 5 jobs and deposited my earnings at the bank's ATM, I went home to the apartment I shared with my roommate Jake. He was a fellow student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, studying computer science while I worked on a business degree. The irony of getting into a conflict with an HOA president while studying business wasn't lost on me. How was the snow removal empire today? Jake called from the kitchen where he was making ramen noodles. Interesting. Got the cops called on me. That got his attention. He poked his head around the corner. "Seriously, what happened?" I explained the whole situation while heating up leftover pizza. Jake listened, nodding along. "Dude, you should document everything. Like, keep records of every interaction with this Debra lady. If she's as crazy as she sounds, you might need it later. That's actually smart. I'll start a file. And maybe join that neighborhood Facebook group. I bet there's drama on there. There was indeed a Meadowbrook Hills community Facebook group, which I found after a quick search. It had about 300 members out of the neighborhood's roughly 250 homes, meaning some households had multiple people in the group. I sent a join request, which was approved within an hour. The group was exactly as dramatic as Jake had predicted. There were posts about lost cats, recommendations for contractors, people selling furniture, and a surprising amount of arguments about garbage can placement and parking etiquette. Debra Patterson was extremely active, posting frequent reminders about HOA regulations and responding to other posts with corrections about rule violations. One recent post caught my eye. A resident named Sarah Mitchell had asked for recommendations for snow removal services, and several people had commented suggesting various companies. Then, about 3 hours ago, someone had recommended me. Ivan Irving does great work and charges reasonable rates. Highly recommend. Debra had responded to that comment 20 minutes later. Please be aware that unlicensed commercial activities in the neighborhood are against HOA bylaws and may result in fines. Several people had responded to Debra's comment, asking how hiring someone to clear snow could possibly be against the rules. She'd replied with a copied and pasted section of the HOA bylaws about commercial vehicles and business operations. Then someone named Patricia Rodriguez had jumped in. Debra, that section is about people running businesses from their homes, not about hiring service providers. You can't prohibit people from hiring contractors. Debra's response: the board will be clarifying this issue at our next meeting. In the meantime, residents should be aware of potential violations. I scrolled further and found multiple similar exchanges over the past several months. Debra seemed to spend hours every day policing the Facebook group, correcting people, issuing warnings, and generally being the fun police. The woman seriously needed a hobby. Over the next week, I continued building my business. I'd printed up simple flyers and distributed them around several neighborhoods, including Meadowbrook Hills. My phone rang constantly with new requests. The snow that winter was relentless, which was great for business but exhausting for me. I was working 6 or 7 hours a day, sometimes more, clearing driveways and walkways. I didn't see Debra Patterson again during that first week, but I heard about her. Apparently, she'd been going door to door to residents who'd hired me, informing them they were in violation of HOA rules and would be fined $50 for each instance of hiring me. Most people ignored her, but a few had actually paid the fine just to avoid conflict. Mrs. Johnson called me on Friday evening, upset. Ivan, I received a formal violation notice from the HOA today. $50 because I hired you. What should I do? I felt anger flare in my chest. Mrs. Johnson, you don't have to pay it. What the HOA is doing isn't legal. They can't fine you for hiring a licensed contractor. But they're saying I violated the bylaws. The bylaws don't override actual law. Look, can you forward me a copy of that violation notice? I want to see exactly what they're claiming. She emailed it to me a few minutes later. It was printed on official HOA letterhead and signed by Debra Patterson as president. The notice claimed that Mrs. Johnson had violated Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws by allowing unauthorized commercial activity within neighborhood boundaries, and was being assessed a $50 fine payable within 30 days. Failure to pay would result in additional fines and potential legal action. I read it twice, feeling my blood pressure rise. This was bullying, plain and simple. And it was targeting elderly residents who might not know their rights or feel confident challenging authority. I called Mrs. Johnson back. "Don't pay the fine. I'm going to look into this and figure out what we can do." "I don't want any trouble, dear." "You won't have any trouble, I promise. Just hold onto that notice and don't pay anything yet." After hanging up, I did some research. Wisconsin HOA law was complicated, but one thing was clear. HOAs had to operate within the bounds of actual state and municipal law. They couldn't create bylaws that violated residents' legal rights, and residents had the right to contract with licensed service providers. I found a free legal aid clinic at the university and scheduled an appointment for the following week. In the meantime, I kept working, and more violation notices went out. By the end of the second week, I'd heard from 7 different residents who'd received fines for hiring me. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday of the month, and it was open to residents. I decided to attend. The meeting was held at a community center within the neighborhood, a small brick building with a meeting room that could hold maybe 40 people. When I arrived at 7 in the evening, about 30 residents were already there, which apparently was a huge turnout. Usually only 5 or 6 people showed up to these meetings. I learned from whispered conversations around me. Debra Patterson sat at a table at the front of the room with 3 other board members. A stern-looking woman in her 50s who I assumed was Brenda Walsh, another woman about the same age who must be Carol Turner, and a nervous-looking man in his 60s who kept fidgeting with his papers. Debra called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of a gavel, like she was presiding over Congress instead of a suburban HOA meeting. She went through standard agenda items: approval of last month's minutes, financial report, updates on neighborhood maintenance issues. Everything was dry and procedural until they reached new business. Item 7, clarification of bylaws regarding commercial activity, Debra announced, her eyes sweeping the room and landing on me for a moment. Over the past several weeks, there has been confusion about Section 7.3 of our bylaws. The board wishes to clarify that this section prohibits all unauthorized commercial activity within neighborhood boundaries, including but not limited to businesses operating from residential properties and unauthorized service providers. A hand shot up in the audience. It was Patricia Rodriguez, the woman from the Facebook group who challenged Debra before. Point of order. The bylaws clearly state that section applies to residents operating businesses from their homes, not to residents hiring outside contractors. We all hire contractors for various services. Are you saying we can't hire plumbers now, electricians, lawn services? Those are different, Debra said dismissively. How are they different? They are established commercial entities. So is Ivan Irving's snow removal service. He has a state-issued business license. Debra's jaw tightened. The board has determined that his activity constitutes a violation because he's operating within the neighborhood on a regular basis. That makes no sense, Patricia countered. The lawn service comes weekly all summer. The garbage company comes twice a week. The mail carrier comes daily. Are they all in violation? Those are essential services. Snow removal is essential during winter. Several people in the audience nodded and murmured agreement. Debra banged her gavel. Order, please. The board has already made this determination. We're not here to debate it. I raised my hand. Debra pretended not to see me. I stood up. Mrs. Patterson, I'd like to speak. This meeting is for residents only. I'm a resident of Milwaukee, operating a legal business with all proper licensing. Officer Kowalski of the Milwaukee Police Department confirmed my licensing is valid when you called the police on me 2 weeks ago. The city clerk's office has confirmed I'm operating within all municipal regulations. With respect, the HOA doesn't have the authority to prohibit residents from hiring me or any other licensed contractor. The room had gone completely silent. Debra's face was turning red again. "Young man, you need to leave this meeting immediately." "No, let him speak," someone called out. Others echoed the sentiment. The nervous man at the board table cleared his throat. "Debra, perhaps we should hear him out. This issue seems to be causing significant concern among residents." "Henry, this is not up for discussion." Henry apparently found his courage. "Actually, as a board member, I think it is. I've been reviewing the bylaws, and I'm not sure our interpretation is correct. Section 7.3 specifically references commercial operations conducted from residential properties and commercial vehicles parked overnight on neighborhood streets. This young man isn't doing either of those things." Brenda Walsh jumped in, her voice sharp. "Henry, the board voted on this interpretation 3-1. Your objection was noted, but you were outvoted. So there was dissent on the board itself." "Interesting." Patricia Rodriguez stood up. "I move that we table this issue and seek an independent legal opinion on whether the HOA has the authority to prohibit residents from hiring licensed contractors." "Second," someone else called out. Debra looked like she wanted to explode. "This is highly irregular." "So is issuing illegal fines," Patricia shot back. "I've spoken with a real estate attorney friend of mine, and she says the HOA is on very shaky legal ground here. If you continue issuing these fines, you're opening the association up to potential lawsuits." That got people's attention, including the board's. Carol Turner leaned over and whispered something to Debra, who whispered something back. They had a brief, heated discussion. Finally, Debra spoke. "Fine. The board will table this issue pending legal review. However, the existing fines stand until the matter is resolved." "That's unacceptable," Patricia said. "You need to put a hold on enforcement until you get legal clarification." More murmuring and nodding from the audience. Henry, the dissenting board member, spoke up again. "I agree. We should suspend enforcement while we seek legal guidance. Otherwise, we're potentially causing financial harm to residents based on an interpretation that may be incorrect." Brenda and Carol both started to argue, but Debra cut them off. "Fine. Enforcement is suspended pending legal review. Meeting adjourned." She banged the gavel hard enough that I was surprised it didn't split. People filed out, several stopping to talk to me. Thomas Patterson, Debra's brother-in-law, shook my hand. "Good for you, standing up like that. Debra needs to be challenged more often." Patricia Rodriguez introduced herself properly. "I'm glad you came tonight. This needed to happen. Debra's been overreaching her authority for years, and the rest of us are tired of it." "What happens now?" I asked. "The board will have to consult with the HOA's attorney. That'll take a few weeks at least. In the meantime, you keep operating your business. You're not doing anything wrong." Over the next few days, I noticed a definite shift in the neighborhood. More people hired me, almost as an act of defiance. My schedule filled up completely, and I had to start turning down jobs because I simply couldn't fit them in. I even hired Jake to help with overflow work, paying him $20 an hour to run a second shovel while I operated the snowblower. The Meadowbrook Hills Facebook group exploded with activity. There were now multiple threads debating HOA authority, with most people critical of Debra's interpretation of the bylaws. Debra kept trying to defend her position, but she was increasingly isolated. Even some of her previous supporters were questioning whether this was the right battle to fight. Then, about 3 weeks after the board meeting, something interesting happened. A process server showed up at my apartment and handed me an envelope. Inside was a notice that the Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association was filing for an injunction against my business, claiming I was violating their bylaws and causing disruption to the neighborhood. I stared at the papers in disbelief. They were actually taking me to court. I immediately called the university legal aid clinic, where I'd already had my consultation. The attorney I'd spoken with, a young woman named Jennifer Chen, reviewed the papers and shook her head. "This is absurd. They don't have standing for this. You're not a member of the HOA, you're not violating any municipal ordinances, and you have all proper licensing. I'll file a response on your behalf." "Will this shut down my business?" "No. This is a civil matter, and the injunction won't be granted because they can't demonstrate any actual harm or legal violation, but you'll have to appear in court for a hearing." The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out in mid-March. In the meantime, business continued to boom. We'd gotten more snow that winter than Milwaukee had seen in 5 years, and everyone needed their driveways cleared. I'd made more money in 3 months than I'd made all previous year working part-time retail, but the stress of the lawsuit weighed on me. I couldn't afford a private attorney, and while Jennifer Chen was excellent, she was handling this pro bono as part of the legal aid program and had limited time to devote to my case. I spent my evenings researching HOA law and preparing for the hearing. The Meadowbrook Hills community, surprisingly, rallied behind me. Patricia Rodriguez started a petition among residents opposing the lawsuit, and over 100 people signed it. Several residents offered to testify on my behalf about the quality of my work and the lack of any disturbance to the neighborhood. Mrs. Johnson was particularly adamant about supporting me. "You're a sweet boy who's just trying to earn an honest living," she told me over the phone. "What Debra is doing is wrong, and I'm going to make sure the judge knows it." The court date arrived on a cold Tuesday morning in mid-March. The snow had finally stopped falling the week before, and temperatures were starting to climb above freezing during the day. My busy season was essentially over, but the outcome of this hearing would determine whether I could operate again next winter. The hearing was held at the Milwaukee County Courthouse downtown. I wore my best suit, which I'd bought at Goodwill for $30, and met Jennifer Chen outside the courtroom at 8:30. She briefed me on what to expect. "This is just a preliminary hearing for their injunction request. The HOA will present their argument for why you should be stopped from operating your business in their neighborhood. We'll present our counterargument. The judge will ask questions and then issue a ruling, probably within a few days." Inside the courtroom, I saw Debra Patterson sitting with an attorney in an expensive-looking suit, a middle-aged man with silver hair and an air of confidence. Brenda Walsh and Carol Turner sat behind them in the gallery. On our side, Patricia Rodriguez, Mrs. Johnson, Thomas Patterson, and about a dozen other Meadowbrook Hills residents had shown up to support me. The judge, the Honorable Sandra Mitchell, was a black woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She reviewed the case file briefly, then looked up at both parties. "This is a hearing on the plaintiff's request for a temporary injunction against the defendant's business operations. Counselor for the plaintiff, proceed." The HOA's attorney, who introduced himself as Richard Brennan, stood and launched into his argument. He claimed that I was operating an unauthorized commercial business within a residential neighborhood in violation of HOA bylaws, that my presence was disruptive, and that I was undermining the authority of the HOA to govern its community. "The Meadowbrook Hills Homeowners Association has the right and responsibility to maintain standards within its neighborhood," Brennan argued. "These standards include restrictions on commercial activity to preserve the residential character of the community." Mr. Irving's repeated violations of these bylaws demonstrate a flagrant disregard for the rules that govern this neighborhood. Judge Mitchell looked up from her notes. Counselor, is Mr. Irving a member of this homeowners association? No, Your Honor, but he is conducting business on properties that are subject to HOA governance. Is he a resident of any property within the HOA's jurisdiction? No, Your Honor. Then how exactly do you have standing to bring this action against him? Brennan paused. Your Honor, the HOA has the authority to regulate activity within its boundaries, including commercial activities conducted by non-residents. Does it? Show me the legal basis for that claim. Brennan flipped through his notes. The HOA bylaws clearly state, I didn't ask about the bylaws, Counselor. I asked about the legal basis. HOA bylaws are contractual agreements between the association and its members. Mr. Irving is not a member. How can the HOA enforce its bylaws against a non-member who is conducting lawful business on private property at the invitation of the property owner? I watched Brennan struggle to answer. This was going better than I'd hoped. Your Honor, the residents who hired Mr. Irving are HOA members and are therefore bound by the bylaws. By hiring him, they are violating those bylaws. That's a separate issue between the HOA and its members. That doesn't give you standing to sue Mr. Irving himself. But let's move on. What specific harm has Mr. Irving caused to the HOA or its members? His commercial activity undermines the residential character of the neighborhood. How? Be specific. He operates commercial equipment, his truck displays commercial signage, and he conducts regular business activities within the neighborhood. Judge Mitchell looked skeptical. So does the Postal Service, waste management, utility companies, and presumably every other service provider. What makes Mr. Irving different? Those are established commercial entities providing essential services. And snow removal isn't essential in Wisconsin during winter. The judge's tone was dry. Counselor, I'm not seeing a compelling argument here, but I'll hear from the defense. Miss Chen. Jennifer Chen stood, and I felt a surge of confidence. She'd prepared thoroughly for this. Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about an HOA overreaching its authority. Mr. Irving operates a legitimate, fully licensed snow removal business. He has a commercial license issued by the state of Wisconsin, liability insurance, and has complied with all municipal regulations. He was hired by individual property owners to provide a service on their private property. The HOA's attempt to prohibit this arrangement violates Wisconsin law regarding the right to contract for services and exceeds the scope of their governing authority. She pulled out documents and handed copies to the judge and to Brennan. These are affidavits from 12 residents of Meadowbrook Hills, all HOA members, attesting that Mr. Irving's work has been professional, non-disruptive, and valuable. Several are elderly residents who are physically unable to clear snow themselves. The HOA's position would effectively prevent these residents from maintaining safe access to their homes during winter. Judge Mitchell read through the affidavits. These are quite compelling. Mr. Brennan, do you have any evidence of actual harm or disruption caused by Mr. Irving's work? Your Honor, the harm is to the HOA's ability to enforce its bylaws and maintain standards. That's not a harm, that's a disagreement about authority. Do you have evidence of noise complaints, property damage, safety issues, anything concrete? The residents violated the bylaws by hiring him. So your entire case is based on the bylaws. Very well. Miss Chen, I assume you have arguments regarding the validity of these bylaws as applied to this situation. Yes, Your Honor. Wisconsin law is clear that HOA bylaws cannot violate public policy or restrict lawful activities protected by state law. Residents have a right to contract for services. The HOA cannot prohibit this. Additionally, the specific bylaw section the HOA is citing, Section 7.3, addresses commercial operations conducted from residential properties and overnight parking of commercial vehicles. Mr. Irving does neither. He provides temporary services at the request of property owners, similar to any contractor. The HOA's interpretation of their own bylaws is overly broad and inconsistent with their plain language. Judge Mitchell nodded slowly. I'm inclined to agree. Mr. Brennan, unless you have additional arguments that address these points, I'm prepared to rule. Brennan stood again. Your Honor, if the court rules against the HOA on this matter, it sets a precedent that undermines HOA authority throughout the county. These associations exist to maintain property values and community standards. Without the ability to regulate commercial activity, their purpose is severely compromised. Counselor, HOAs are not governments. They are private associations with limited authority granted by contract and state law. They cannot expand that authority simply because they find it convenient. If the HOA in this case wants to restrict residents from hiring snow removal services, they need to go through the proper process of amending their bylaws with resident approval and ensuring any such restrictions comply with state law. They cannot unilaterally reinterpret existing bylaws to prohibit lawful activity by non-members. She looked down at her papers, made some notes, then looked back up. I'm denying the request for an injunction. Mr. Irving is operating a lawful business with proper licensing. He is not subject to HOA bylaws as a non-member, and the HOA has failed to demonstrate any legal basis for restricting his activities. Furthermore, the HOA has failed to demonstrate any concrete harm resulting from his work. The residents who hired him have a right to contract for services, and the HOA's attempt to prohibit this is an overreach of their authority. She banged her gavel. Case dismissed. Next case. I sat there stunned for a moment, barely processing what had just happened. Jennifer Chen turned to me with a huge smile. We won. We won, I repeated, the reality sinking in. Behind us, the Meadowbrook Hills residents broke into quiet applause. Mrs. Johnson was beaming. Patricia Rodriguez gave me a thumbs up. Even Thomas Patterson looked pleased, though he glanced apologetically at his sister-in-law, who was gathering her things with a face like a thundercloud. Outside the courtroom, several residents congratulated me. Mrs. Johnson hugged me, which was sweet but a little surprising. I'm so glad that's over, she said. Now maybe Debra will finally leave well enough alone. I wasn't so sure about that, but I appreciated the sentiment. Over the next few days, news of the court ruling spread through Meadowbrook Hills and beyond. The story even made it into the local news section of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a small article about an HOA lawsuit dismissed for overreach. The article quoted Judge Mitchell's ruling and included a brief interview with Patricia Rodriguez about HOA authority and residents' rights. The Facebook group exploded again, this time with most people celebrating the outcome. Debra, Brenda, and Carol were conspicuously silent. A few residents who'd supported the HOA's position tried to argue that this was a bad precedent, but they were shouted down by the majority who were tired of what they saw as overly aggressive enforcement. Then something unexpected happened. Henry, the dissenting board member, posted a message to the Facebook group announcing his resignation from the HOA board and calling for a special election to replace all board positions. His post was long and detailed, but the core message was clear. He believed the current board leadership had lost the confidence of the residents and was no longer acting in the community's best interests. The legal fees for this unnecessary lawsuit came out of HOA funds, he wrote. That's money paid by all of us that could have been used for actual neighborhood improvements. Instead, it was spent on a personal vendetta that the board was warned would fail. This is not responsible leadership. The post got over 200 reactions and 100 comments within hours, most supportive. People started sharing stories of their own conflicts with Debra and calling for change. Within a week, a petition was circulating calling for a special election. Under the HOA bylaws, if 25% of residents signed such a petition, the board had to schedule an election within 60 days. The petition got the required signatures in 4 days. I watched all this unfold with a mixture of satisfaction and discomfort. I hadn't intended to trigger a neighborhood political crisis. I just wanted to run my business, but the genie was out of the bottle now. Residents who'd been quietly frustrated with Debra's leadership for years were now openly organizing. A slate of challenger candidates announced they were running for the board, including Patricia Rodriguez, Thomas Patterson, and 3 other residents I didn't know. Their platform was simple, transparent, reasonable governance that respected residents' rights. The election was scheduled for late April. By then, the snow was completely gone, and I transitioned my business focus to spring cleanup services, though I was still operating primarily in other neighborhoods. I'd had enough drama in Meadowbrook Hills. But I was curious about the election outcome, so on the night of the HOA annual meeting and election, I checked the Facebook group obsessively for updates. The results, when they were posted, were decisive. All 5 challenger candidates won their board positions. Debra Patterson, Brenda Walsh, and Carol Turner were all voted out, along with 2 other board members who'd supported them. The vote wasn't even close. Patricia Rodriguez received the most votes and was subsequently elected president by the new board. Her first act as president was to post a message to the Facebook group. To all residents, the new board is committed to reasonable, transparent governance that respects your rights as homeowners. We will be conducting a comprehensive review of all HOA bylaws and enforcement practices. We invite your feedback and participation. This is your community and the board exists to serve you, not the other way around. The post got an overwhelmingly positive response. One of the first comments was from Mrs. Johnson. "Thank goodness. Now maybe we can all just be good neighbors again." I thought that was probably the best summary of the whole situation. As spring turned to summer, I continued running my business, expanding into lawn maintenance and eventually hiring 2 more part-time workers to keep up with demand. My first-year revenue exceeded $30,000, which wasn't bad for a college side business that I'd started with just a truck and a snowblower. I did end up working in Meadowbrook Hills again, but under much different circumstances. Several residents hired me for lawn maintenance, and the new HOA board actually contracted with me to do the common area landscaping at a fair rate. I ran into Debra Patterson one time that summer. I was mowing the lawn at her brother-in-law's house, and she happened to be visiting. She stood on the porch staring at me for a full minute before going inside without saying a word. I felt a little bad for her, honestly. She'd lost her position, her authority, and probably a good bit of respect in the community, all because she couldn't let go of control. Thomas Patterson came out a few minutes later and handed me a cold bottle of water. "Don't mind Debra, she's still bitter about everything." "I'm sorry it turned out that way," he shook his head. "Don't be. She brought it on herself." Maybe this will teach her that being right and being reasonable aren't always the same thing. She was so focused on the rules that she forgot about the people those rules are supposed to serve. That seemed like a good lesson for anyone in a position of authority, HOA president or otherwise. By the time I graduated from UW-Milwaukee, 2 years later, my business had grown into a legitimate full-time operation. I'd incorporated, hired a small staff, and was servicing residential and commercial properties all over the Milwaukee area. The company was profitable enough that I could focus on it full-time rather than getting a traditional job. I sometimes thought about that first conflict with Debra Patterson and how differently things could have turned out. If I'd backed down that first day, if I'd let her bully me into leaving, I probably would have given up on the business entirely. Instead, standing my ground had not only validated my right to operate, but had sparked a larger change in the Meadowbrook Hills community. The neighborhood was different now, by all accounts. The new HOA board was more collaborative and less authoritarian. They still maintained standards, but they did it with common sense and respect for residents' autonomy. Violations were handled with friendly reminders rather than immediate fines. The community actually felt like a community rather than a police state. Patricia Rodriguez, who remained HOA president through my graduation and beyond, told me once that the whole situation had been a wake-up call for a lot of people. We'd gotten complacent, she said. We let Debra and her allies take control because most of us couldn't be bothered to get involved. Your situation showed us what happens when good people don't participate in their own governance. It's a lesson that applies way beyond just HOAs. She wasn't wrong. The whole experience had taught me a lot about standing up for yourself, about the importance of proper licensing and documentation, and about how small local disputes can sometimes reflect larger issues of authority and freedom. It also taught me that sometimes the right thing to do is push back against unreasonable rules, even when it would be easier to just comply. Officer Kowalski had been right that day when he confirmed my commercial license was valid. That simple validation gave me the confidence to fight the larger battle. Looking back now, years later, I'm grateful for the whole mess. It made me a better business owner, taught me to keep impeccable records and stay on the right side of the law, and showed me that communities work best when everyone has a voice, not just the loudest or most aggressive person in the room. And I never had to deal with an HOA Karen quite like Debra Patterson again, though I encountered plenty of difficult people over the years. But none of them ever called the cops on me, and none of them ever made me question my right to run an honest business. That first winter in Meadowbrook Hills, with its snow-covered driveways and neighborhood drama, became a foundational story in my company's history. When I hired new employees, I'd sometimes tell them about it as a lesson in doing things the right way, standing your ground, and never being intimidated by people who confuse authority with wisdom. The business continued to grow, eventually expanding beyond Milwaukee into surrounding counties. I bought better equipment, hired a full management team, and developed systems and processes that turned my one-man operation into a professional company. But I never forgot those early days, working in the freezing cold with a borrowed snowblower, just trying to make enough money for tuition. And somewhere in Meadowbrook Hills, the neighborhood moved forward without Debra Patterson at its helm. The community thrived under more balanced leadership. Property values actually increased according to the real estate data I looked up out of curiosity. Turns out, people preferred living in a place where they could hire whatever services they wanted without fear of fines and harassment. The last I heard, Debra had moved to Florida, where I imagined she was probably terrorizing some retirement community HOA. But that was just speculation. What I knew for certain was that her attempt to shut down my business had failed spectacularly, and in the process, she'd lost everything she'd worked to control. Meanwhile, my business cards still read Ivan Irving Snow Removal Services, though we'd long since expanded beyond just snow removal. And under my name and contact information, there was a small line that I'd added after the lawsuit. Fully licensed and insured, operating legally since 2023. It was a small detail, but it mattered. It was a reminder of where I'd started and what I'd overcome. And every time someone called to hire my company, every time we showed up to do a job and do it well, it was proof that standing up for yourself is worth it. The snow would come again every winter, covering driveways and walkways across Milwaukee. And every winter, my company would be there to clear it, properly licensed, fully legal, and unbothered by anyone who thought they had the authority to say otherwise. Because at the end of the day, that's what the whole fight had been about. The right to work honestly, follow the rules that actually mattered, and not be pushed around by petty tyrants with clipboards and gavels. Officer Kowalski had confirmed my commercial license was valid that first day, and that confirmation had been enough to build an entire business on. Sometimes the system works the way it's supposed to. Sometimes standing up to a bully doesn't just protect you, but helps an entire community. And sometimes, a simple snow removal job becomes something much more important than clearing a driveway. It becomes a stand for principle, for fairness, and for the idea that following the law should be enough to protect you from those who want to control you with made-up restrictions and illegal fines. The judge saw through the HOA's overreach. The community rallied behind common sense. And justice, in this case, actually prevailed. That was the real story behind my business, the one I'd tell for years to come whenever anyone asked how I got started. It wasn't just about snow removal or lawn maintenance or building a profitable company. It was about a young college student who refused to back down when a HOA Karen called the cops on him, and an officer who confirmed that his commercial license was valid. Everything else flowed from that moment, that decision to stand firm rather than fold. And in the end, it made all the difference.